UK and Europe, and good afternoon to those joining us from the US and also into Canada. Indeed, I expect those across Europe and UK, I expect and would hope that maybe you have a glass of wine in hand, and those in the US and Canada, you can join us shortly on that, or maybe just enjoy your cup of ice cold tea and coffee. This is the culmination and the final webinar of our summit 221 Purpose Over Profit. I would like to start with thanks to the industry we serve. We've had over 1,300 individuals across the industry globally attending and listening in to our to the activity over the last 3 days. 21 webinars, 42 regional and global chief operating officers, 21 chief control officers, 12 worldwide leading academics, the FCA and AFME, 16 leading corporate authorities on culture, conduct, controls, and purpose. I'd actually want to take this specific moment, and that's there's been one team: Gwen, Charlotte, Sophie, Miriam, Tim, Holly, Patrick, Simon, and Larry, that have worked as a team over the last 6 months to bring this 3 days together. So there's a particular note and a closing note for my team. So thank you very much. What we're going to do in this fireside chat, I'm delighted to actually have some of the panelists and indeed my chief of staff and COO here to add to the conversation. This is a fireside chat, and I believe that Rich Evans, who I'm going to introduce you in a minute, has actually got the fire to prove it. And what we're going to be looking at is just some of the general themes that were captured here over the last 3 days. The role of supervision and surveillance, the role of training and character, the role of governance and controls. We looked at the tsunami of regulation of its impact over the last 10 years. We looked at emerging technologies and behavioral science. I'm also going to plug this at this moment. Tomorrow I have a book coming out, To Catch a Thief. This follows my first book, No Place to Hide. A readership of 1, that's what my brother commented on it when it was published. And I said, well, who's that? And he said, actually, if you can persuade your mother, that will be the one. The Catch a Thief is 22 articles in total. 8 of them are written by leading academics. So you can certainly say that 8 of the 22 will be worthwhile reading. And why would I want you to dig deep into your pockets to potentially buy these? It is not to line my own pockets, it is to line the pockets of my charity, GCF Bosnia, where through the contributions of the global COO and Chief Control Officer community over the last 5 years, we've raised £78,000. We've rebuilt a primary school in central Bosnia in the memory of the 4 soldiers that I lost when I was on operational tour in the former Yugoslavia in 1994 to 1995. The book, which you can also buy, Donkey Melon Bully Beef, that has actually got at the beginning of it 211 COOs which signed and paid for its design and production, ensuring that 100% of the monies raised from also this book as well has gone to the charity. So thank you all. And I'm going to stop sharing, because what I'm going to do now is introduce my panel. I look a bit sort of in the dark here. I need to pay my electricity bill. So what I'm going to do is actually just do some round robin introductions, and then we're going to go into sort of fireside chat. And obviously, I think what we will do on that point is probably start with Rich, because he's the only one with a fire. But before that, let's just go for some introductions. Ruth.
Yes, I'm Ruth Steinholtz. I'm founder of Arete Work and author of a book called Ethical Business Practice and Regulation, which is a behavioral and values-driven approach to compliance and enforcement. And I'm based in London.
Thank you, Ruth. Rich.
Hello, everyone. Richard Evans. I'm solution lead for regulation and compliance at DXC Technology, which is an IT services company that has many of you as clients, many asset managers and banks as clients globally. Spent 25 years in capital markets prior to joining DXC.
Thank you, Rich. Gwen.
Hello, I am Gwen Wilcox. I'm the COO of Armstrong Wolf. I also happen to be the Women in the CEO Community Global Lead.
Thank you, Patrick.
Hello, everybody. I'm Patrick Butler. I'm Managing Partner of the Armstrong Wolf Institute for COO Professionals. a new concept which we're building out at the moment, and which has already taken some great strides forward. Formerly a diplomat, formerly an M&A banker, formerly an operating officer in investment banking, and formerly a compliance officer. Last two roles in roles of major transformation, and in the last 8 years working with investment banks, commercial banks, and retail banks to help build sort of an effective operating model using the basics of behavior, conduct, culture to drive value and to manage risk. And more recently in starting the UK Finance Conduct and Culture Academy, which we're still running.
Thank you, Patrick. Sapna.
Hi, I'm Sapna Dattani. I'm a former COO and also Chief of Staff. I worked at Deutsche Bank and DWS for most of my career thus far, and prior to that, I was a strategy consultant at Oliver Wyman.
Thank you. Miriam.
Hi, everyone. I'm Miriam Rooney. I have just started at Armstrong Wolf as Chief of Staff and Client Director for iCook. My formulas aren't nearly as impressive of all of you, but I've come from a coaching background, so this last 3 days have been so interesting in terms of the behaviors. Having studied and worked a lot in terms of positive psychology and just the behaviors around what makes us do what we do. So it's been fascinating. Thank you.
I'd also like to point out that Miriam actually, we worked together 20 years ago. And it either says actually that I must have done something right for her to consider working with me again, or she needed 20 years out to actually go through it again. So depending which way you look at that. So Rich, as you're the only one with actually a fire next to you, I mean, Rich, you've shadowed and seen the evolution of Armstrong Wolf, and actually you participated and supported when you were a COO at Barclays. And actually, really grateful that you participated in some forums this week. What is it that the aim that we wanted this week was for Armstrong Wolf to bring to the COO community and to their colleagues, be it in first or second line, the debate around conduct, culture, purpose, how technologies can be used, etc. I'm just wondering what you've taken from this, not just necessarily from your own session, but any observations that you've got.
Sure, thanks, Morris. So the first observation is change is just relentless and complexity just continues at a pace that is accelerating. One of the first sessions that I participated in was the opportunities and challenges around Brexit and what that might have in terms of an influence on the industry that we function in. And it's just getting more complicated, more regulation, different regulatory regimes, different interpretations, and that just is going to place a huge burden on what I think is the most interesting, the most fulfilling, but also the hardest, but most rewarding job I've ever done, which is the COO role, because everything falls to the COO and the buck stops with the COO. What I think is missing, though, that the industry can benefit from, having now spent a couple of years in the technology industry, my reflection on the difference between the two is that the technology industry is far more open to partnerships and discussing opportunities for collaboration. And I think our industry can learn a lot from that. However, that is in a backdrop where we've been almost encouraged not to talk to each other for a long period of time because of the ills of the past. Every meeting that you have that involves somebody from a competitive organization starts with a legal disclaimer that is read out and a reminder of what you're allowed to discuss and what you're not allowed to discuss. But I think the last year has allowed us to broaden our horizons and speak to our competitors in a way that encourages far more collaboration. I think our regulators are far more open-minded about that. So I think if we can start to collaborate a lot more, share common experiences, and these types of forums that you've been hosting, Maurice, I think are critical to that, including things like AFME, including the IA and other types of forums. I think they're absolutely critical for people to come together and form those partnerships and learn from each other. I'm a bit cynical, though. I am still to be convinced as to whether we are moving towards an environment of purpose over profit. I think we've made massive progress. The announcement today around financial services industry all coming together to focus on hitting net zero targets is a huge positive. But having spent so long in financial services and in my career, I've learned that things are cyclical. And I'm still not convinced that when it comes to the crunch, we will prioritize purpose over profit.
Rich, can I then ask you then just two things? A lot of people, you've heard the echoes of CEOs over the years saying, we're not a bank, we're a technology company. First of all, I want you to get your view on that now working for a technology company. And then secondly, now that you're embedded in a technology company, how different do you think you'd be if you went back as a COO enriched with that experience?
I wish I'd known 20% of what I know now about the capabilities of technology and what's available as a toolkit that you can utilize within an organization. You know, the default is, what does my IT partner think? And you do have this fundamental maybe misalignment of objectives, because you do have an IT department that is focused on doing the exciting stuff, which is building stuff. And I still think that exists within many organizations, and the opportunity to look at externally at what's available is still not where it needs to be. You know, the first mindset that I see within our organization now, within tech, is what's the problem and what is the toolkit that's available, whether it's internal or external, that can solve that problem. So we spend as much time with external partners as we do with our internal technology organization. And I don't think that's the same within financial services. Whether banks are tech organizations, they're not. You know, they don't operate as tech organizations. They're not selling technology. Their role is not to know what the next greatest and best piece of technology that can solve a problem is. Banks' roles are to fund, to finance, to allow access to capital markets, to ensure that there's a provision of a safe store of value, and to be a trusted entity. And it's just not the same as being a tech organization. First and foremost, a bank looks after things for you. It's a trusted and safe place, and hopefully it helps you grow those assets. And that's very different to a technology organization that is fundamentally about innovation and growing and using the latest technology to solve problems. The final difference, I think, is there is a very different cultural mentality around failure and around taking risk. If you take no risk, you'll get the risk-free rate. And that's, at the moment, US 30-year treasuries are paying a couple of percent. The last time I looked, most banks are targeting over 10% return on their equity. So you have to take risk to make a return. But we've come from an environment over the last 10 years where taking risk and getting it wrong has been frowned upon, has been penalized very, very dramatically. Understandably so in certain circumstances, but it's very different in the tech world where taking risk is fundamentally perceived to be innovating and taking risk in the right way.
Thank you, Rich. It's actually when you talked about the role of the bank, is that you almost actually summarizing what purpose was. But the one aspect you said about sort of a trusted entity, whether we've got to that point yet, I think is still under debate. But I think so. So the segue into that in relation, I'm going to come to Sapna now. The Sapna that you're a COO and actually your own technology, plus you've done buy and sell side, and actually you came from a consulting pedigree. I'm just wondering whether what have you taken from this week or 3 days? Seems like a week. These 3 days, and also the participation you had in the role that you had, and then actually if we could finish with Richard's view of the world of technology and the interface and how it works with the industry. There you go. There's a few questions.
Okay. So look, I think that it's been great this week to have a conference or summit, sorry, that focuses on more than just content. So a lot of discussions that are still going on now in various industries are very much content focused. And I think a lot of the discussions this week have been more around how we do business, how we work together. And it's a very different set of discussions. And I found them really fascinating, especially the session on Monday, which talked about character traits and how we often look over those when we're thinking about leadership. And but they actually play a really important part in decision-making processes and success of organizations and the way that we run things. We're focused too much on sort of cognitive processes as opposed to necessarily the temperament of people and what makes good leaders. And I think that sort of discussion is really important across any industry, but especially in this one. And it's good to have highlighted that, and hopefully there can be, it's, you know, kicked off a bunch of discussions for people post the summit. I think then in terms of if we had also had this summit without the pandemic, it probably would have been focused from a content perspective more on costs and efficiencies and digital transformation. And I think that the sort of acceleration in various trends over the past year or so, both in terms of the use of technology and also the social agenda, means that the COO's role in how we work rather than what we're doing has become, you know, really at the forefront of what we should have been thinking about up to now and what we need to think about going forward. So things like working from home, okay, flexible working has always been something that's been discussed as a nice to have. We used to always do planning around how can we get 120% kind of efficiency of our real estate and get people to hopefully work from home 1 day a week. That's completely changed on its head in the different models now that banks and any company worldwide is thinking about. But I think a lot of that, putting that into practice, thinking about return to work, I know Maurice, you've done a lot of work on that with the community, is going to be really critical. We're still at the beginning of that journey and how things are going to evolve, and you know whether we really are at the end of the pandemic. It feels like we're still right in the middle of it, and who knows when there might be another lockdown. And I think the issues that it's caused in terms of how do we train that younger generation, that was one of the topics that came up earlier today as well. I get the sense that a lot of those really critical questions are going to sit with the COO, especially given the fact that CEOs right now are really being looked to focus in organizations what and how do they compete, how do you rejig the business model for where we are today, and the COO, I believe, will be looked to for how do we do these things. The other thing on the COO's agenda, which will have changed and again has been accelerated over the past 12 to 15 months. If you think about COOs, they were sort of tangentially involved in diversity and inclusion agendas. Yes, they'd be part of discussions, part of meetings. A lot of it was being led by HR. I think that will change a lot. I think that the discussions around really big social questions, whether it's Me Too, Black Lives Matter, all of these things, there's no part of society that's not touched by them. And I don't think financial services either can turn a blind eye to the changes there. And again, I think a lot of that will sit with the COO in being forward thinking around how do we get this right? How do we look at behaviors? How do we encourage the right sort of collaboration and forward thinking on these sorts of topics? realizing that there is no best model, no one's done it perfectly, and we're all sort of learning as we go along. So when I think about some of the key issues that we raised today in the panel that we did around the role of the COO post-crisis, I think three of the kind of key issues, I think, for me to take away from that was, and this kind of ties into what Rich just said, that decision-making isn't risk-free. And we have got to a point where people are very reticent to make decisions. We need to move away from that, and we need to go back to understanding what are the risks that we're taking and how can we potentially mitigate them. Secondly, I think there was a question today around how do we really measure people from a conduct perspective. What we have so far are lots of programs, a lot of things that are, regulatory driven. But I think as some of the recent events that we've seen, whether it's people being called out for their behaviors or even Archegos, we haven't got that fully right yet. And is there a better way to look at people and say, this is the sort of ethical, moral, best behavior that we would like to have across the organization? And how can we embed that? And again, what's the COO's role in creating that tone from the top and showing that good behavior can be rewarded? It's not always just about the P&L that you generate. And that bad behavior is also addressed, which I think that often is shied away from, especially if someone's seen to be a very high producer. And then the third thing is around the role in society for financial services. It's been an interesting crisis from the perspective that banks haven't been at the epicenter of it, given what happened in 2007, 2008. And banks have really sort of helped to rebuild society through participating in improving lending, sort of all of the digitalization of payments, so allowing commerce to continue in a way that it wouldn't have been able to, given all the shops have been shut. So I think that thinking about how do banks play a critical role in society, and I guess that goes to this purpose question, I feel that a lot of that agenda will fall to the COO over the next couple of years and longer. And one of the topics we didn't cover today, but Patrick and I were discussing afterwards, and Rich mentioned as well, is around climate change. That's what people are starting to get concerned about, but in the way that you've never really been concerned about the kind of pandemic. This is something that could really come upon us without a lot of warning. And I think we do need to think about the COO's role in that. And then finally, I guess, when we think about all of those things, and again, what you said, Maurice, and what Rich said, how do we use technology to really help us think through each of those? And I guess this goes back to the data that financial institutions have available to them, and really being much smarter about how we use it, how we process it, whether that's to help with the myriad of decision making that we need to do, which at the moment is fully under human control. How much of that can we get technology, machine learning, AI to kind of help us through that process? How can we think about measuring behavior and storing that information? And ultimately, it's always going to probably be a human call on whether someone's behaved well or not. But again, can technology help us with that? And again, with climate change, the amount of information that we have, really being able to understand who are we lending to, which companies are we supporting? A lot of that data, I think, is out there, and it's just not used enough by the banks.
Great, Sam. I'm just going to ask one thing. I know we've had conversations around career optionality for COOs, etc. And you created optionality through the diversity of your experience, in relation to your consulting background, your change background, your COO background. Has the 3 days of participating, has it refreshed, realigned your thoughts about more dedicating your purpose to actually your individual career purpose to actually being a COO? Do you think is it changed that in relation to, has it made the appetite stronger in relation to actually that is something that's possibly going to be more engaging than potentially it was in the past?
Look, I think for me, the COO role, in the version that I've done it in, has always been a great mix of the strategy side and thinking around and problem solving, plus the day-to-day kind of running of a business and the sometimes minutiae that come associated with that. And I think, over the course of the 3 days, it's really interesting to hear different people's perspectives, what the issues that they've been focused on, what they're worried about next. But I think it is one of those roles that is ultimately has the same title in many areas, but what you actually do in it varies so much. So I think it's definitely something that I would want to continue doing. And I think the role that we play in really helping shape organizations and how they function is really critical. And I think many COOs have picked up quite a lot of experience of different crises, different issues. I think the problems that we have coming towards us now are very different in nature, but hopefully a lot of those problem solving techniques and using collaboration, and as Rich said, thinking more about partnership and not just being totally inwardly focused within the organization. I think, again, the COO is in a great position to be able to deliver on some of those things going forward.
Thank you. It's interesting you note, well, not interesting, the point around climate risk. We've talked about different types of risk this week, and then you think about climate risk as an existential risk. It is the fundamental risk that we are dealing with as a case in relation to humanity. And so I think, when people say that shouldn't be a purpose, I think that is an overriding common purpose. Even when you think about people think about ESG and things, you can still get the feeling they're looking at what is the opportunity to profit out of this. You get the feeling that they're going, but that's not what we're talking about. You've got to think, why have we got to that point? So I think you need to actually have a higher value base in relation to the climate and actually how the industry is dealing with it. I mean, actually, but you could argue if the regulation makes that happen, that's a good thing. But I still think that if they're looking at it in relation to how can I profit out of this existential crisis, then I still think that's the wrong way of looking at it. Maybe that will be a good one for debates. Patrick's smiling. That usually means two things. That means either he's thinking you're right or you're an idiot.
But it may not be a regulatory driver that changes this going forward. It might actually just be society. So you're right. ESG is very, it's very low touch. It's just sort of making sure that you're not doing anything very, very, very bad, but it's not thinking about whether you as an organization are doing anything good. And I think as we see that transfer of wealth over the next 15 to 20 years to that next generation that is really pushing forward a lot of these topics that we've seen over the last couple of years, there is going to be more demand for, this is where we want the money to go. This is the sorts of companies that we want to support and build, and the ones that we don't feel have a real societal purpose and value, let's move away from them. And I think it's hard to imagine yet, but I think we mustn't underestimate that wave.
Yeah. Thank you, Gwen. I'm going to come to you now, Gwen, in relation to, first of all, Gwen, I just want to actually thank you specifically for all your efforts, and you're instrumental in relation to helping Armstrong Wolf get to this point. I know that you had Charlotte and Sophie and the team behind you, but the application, the hard work you've had, because this is the first time we've done it, so that just public applause and thanks to you for doing this, Gwen. So, but that's your annual compliment, by the way. I just wanted to go, Gwen, but your role when moderating and listening in has been with a COO hat on, but your other one that I know you're particularly passionate around is your role in leading the discussions around diversity on behalf of Armstrong Wolf. What have you taken away from when you've been able to take a breath and listen or participate? What have you taken away from these 3 days?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for asking me. Indeed, it is a team effort. I just wanted to highlight that as well. It really is. It really was. And thank you to you also, Maurice, for giving us this opportunity. So, well, for me, my observations having attended all of the sessions is the passion and the high engagement that our markets and asset management speakers have demonstrated actually in discussing purpose over profit, or perhaps purpose for profit. And that our new normal also poses major challenges for corporate culture and the management of conduct, but it also highlighted a greater focus on sustainability, I think, to echo what Sapna was saying. And it was encouraging to hear what financial services actually is doing on ESG. It was actually a big focus on the session I managed with Tracy McDermott, who was chairing the session, particularly around driving diversity and inclusion, retention and acquisition programs. I think that was just fascinating to hear what Standard Chartered is doing on that front, and really encouraging cognitive diversity. I think that has been one of the main highlights in all of the sessions that I've attended and also chaired. I think it's very important, obviously, to look at the ESG side of it, and particularly, obviously, chairing the women in the CEO community and driving and drumming that the topic of cognitive diversity throughout all of our program. I think it was apparent that this is something that financial services is thinking about, and obviously trying to apply as much as possible. So big highlight for me.
Thank you, Gwen. I think I was, it's one way I wasn't surprised, but I was also pleasantly surprised. And maybe this is because the consciousness of the community itself and the industry is that I think almost every single debate either I participated in or I actually listened to, the inclusion came into that conversation somewhere. So I think one of the things I've taken away is that it is truly embedded in the narrative of today. And I think that's very important. And then obviously the COO is the center of an organization, and collectively the COOs are the beating heart of the industry, and therefore that they are well placed to actually promote this. But that's one of the things I took away from 3 days. Ruth, can I you both participated and listened into a number, and I know that you've got views also around sustainability and climate, etc. And just Ruth, what are your takeaways from the 3 days, or any comments that you've got on the conversations we've had in this session alone?
Well, just starting with my overall comments. So I have a preference for the importance of generalists, and because they can see the big picture. And as this was my introduction to the COO community, that preference has only been reinforced by listening to the wide range of really wonderful conversations and very well-rounded conversations. I thought it wasn't, whatever was being discussed, I felt it was being discussed in a much more holistic way than you often find, where people have a very narrow focus. So that was really a nice thing to discover. I think, just going back to something that Rich said, I had a 30+ year corporate career in the legal function, but I also worked in crisis management, security, and ethics and compliance. And I have to say that, so I'm sort of divided between being an optimist and a cynic. It's difficult for those two things to coexist, but they do. But I would say overall, over the last 30+ years, I think the general trend is positive in the right direction, that more people, and this conference, or this summit really showed that, are trying to make their world and the world better places, and are not just focused on money and their own, their own financial situation. As a recovering corporate lawyer, I suppose I'm not naive, and I know there's a lot more work to be done, and that there are dark forces pulling in the other direction. But I think that fundamentally this focus on purpose and values, so I'm particularly interested in values, but purpose together, is what really ignites that energy and motivation for people to want to do something, to make things better. And that it's not naive to think that it's, that is something important that we really need to be working on. And so I was very pleased to hear that, the conversations in this summit around it. And I would say that we need to keep talking about it, because fundamentally this point about sustainability and climate, et cetera. One of the panels yesterday was talking about 3 types of capital: social, natural, and financial. And I do think we have to get better at looking at the costs of things in those terms, and at what we gain in those terms. And if we do that, I think it will be easier to make the transition. And also something that Patrick, that you've been talking about since the very beginning of this summit and before, is the point about organizations that are purpose-driven, that are values-driven, that try to do the right thing. They're more successful. There's plenty of evidence of that now. And so it's not like when I first started talking about values-driven organizations 15 years ago, people were saying, oh, that's fine, but do they make any money? But I do think now that, and some of the panelists discussed this, that we really can say that these organizations in the medium to long term, and even there's evidence in the short term, are more successful. So I think we have to keep talking about purpose. We have to keep talking about values. And my feeling is that COOs, much like some general counsels, and I will say that not all general counsels fit into this category, but because they have a wide, broad view of a business, because they understand what the risks are and how the business functions, they are uniquely suited to try to bring this more holistic, forest for the trees. I mean, they can see the forest, they can see over the forest, and therefore their role in driving organizations towards a sustainable future and driving purpose and values into the organization is key. So I think, yeah.
Thank you, Ruth. That's a perfect handoff to Patrick. Now, Patrick, I'm conscious. First of all, your support this week, Patrick, has been fantastic, and co-moderating and moderating a number of the sessions yourself. I'm sort of wary to ask you in relation to so having set up the UK Finance and Culture Academy. Your view of these 3 days, and whether, I think the point that Satna brought out was quite interesting about we're focused on the how, and the COO is all about asking the how, and how do I operationalize that? And there's always that fear of, okay, I get it, enough theory, but just how do I take that and embed it in the organization? Your passion is about purpose and culture and conduct, and you've married your passion and vocation with what you do as in your day-to-day life in relation to your business activities. What have you taken away from 3 days, Patrick?
Well, it's extraordinary. There have been views which I've seen before, and I've been seeing burgeoning understanding and passion and enlightenment through the 3 days, which has been fascinating. And the conversations show people perhaps at varying different points of evolution. And Rich actually has made an extremely good point, which is this question of, in fact, I'm not sure if you deliberately did it or not, Rich, but when you talked about the role of banks, and Maurice touched on this about things like being a safe place for assets, helping people to grow their assets, financing business and innovation and so on. Surely that is the purpose of banks. But then, of course, we have this demand for the 10% plus of return on equity. How does that reconcile? Because what you have there is a massive conflict, potentially, because that return on equity is a short-term issue, and most people's goals, aspirations, economic growth is a long-term journey. So this is the question about purpose, of how we actually identify purpose and articulate it, and then build our business towards that purpose. The values are there to give people the sense of purpose, personal purpose, align their personal purpose with that purpose. And when you do that, when you start to do that, you start to create the attributes, you bring out the characters from within into behaviors, into physical behaviors in an organization that don't just look after risk, don't just get concerned about the possible losses and risks and pain points, but they start to think about what they can do to make everything better. So they start to innovate, and that drives productivity and when you invest in that, you get a massive return on your investment. And it's, I promise you, it's more than 10% of return on investment. So with that, with the discussion of the conduct and culture, particularly the role of the COO, as Ted McDonald said, having its tentacles everywhere, it is in such a unique position that if COOs can find a way to just take that little step back, look at what they're currently doing and the extent to which that is very inward or backward looking in terms of trying to prevent risk and minimizing that, and start looking towards creating value. They can start to use the tools that have been presented. They can start to use some of the motivation techniques, the alignment techniques that many people have started to describe, to create an environment where there is a safety net for those risks. The safety net is that people are actually thinking. They're not just following blindly a process or a procedure or commands or orders, but they're actually thinking about that overall purpose and therefore what is the right decision to make in every circumstance. And once you actually trigger that, that is when all the pieces fall into place and you create a highly functioning organization. And then when you take the purpose, what everybody's talked about in terms of climate is going to hit us hard. It's this little runaway train which is way down the track at the moment and doesn't seem to be moving, but it's accelerating. And all of a sudden, we're going to find ourselves in a very unpleasant situation. The conversation that Sapna and I had after our session was fascinating, because I do work with a company which is looking to create real change in carbon footprint, but to do it in a way that creates value. And in our chat, we just had a little bit of a tappy discussion with Richard, saying, it is we have a capitalist society. People are not going to want to spend money or lose returns just to do something which they know is right, because guess what? They're not paid to do that until they are paid to do that. But if we can actually make that role or that function now into something that is profitable, because we invest in companies that do this and create savings and energy, lower energy consumption, so that they are creating value, all of a sudden you get both. And that is the hidden goal. So when banks start to look at the future, when asset managers, investors, investment managers, and sales and trading and banks start to look at their purpose, if they look further down the track and they start to create an innovation mentality within the organization, including the control function, all of a sudden everybody can start working together to create value out of what is coming down the track. So again, that purpose is key, because if you align people with the right sort of purpose, then they will also improve your control environment, which is a key focus of everybody. What the CCO discussion highlighted to me was this focus on control and making sure that we keep everything nice and safe and within parameters. And yet, if you create reflexivity, this is a term which I have no doubt, and unfortunately I wasn't able to join the second session yesterday, but reflexivity rather than inflexivity, as a character, as a trait, as a behavior, as a conduct measure, if you like, or a cultural driver. Reflexivity in your organization means that they react. And when you have emerging risk, they see it coming down the track and they react. They don't wait to be told what to do. And that sort of activity, that sort of behavior will drive value and improve risk management within the organization. So I'm very heartened by the conversations. I was particularly heartened by the extent to which COOs, maybe this is Ruth's point of view, coming into this community for the first time, that the conversation went beyond just that cost control and the usual sort of conversations, but to how we can actually make a difference. Now, you asked me, what can people do? So what? What can COOs do? And we ask this question at each point. There are a number of things, but what they really can do is change the dialogue, change the debate in the organization, particularly with decision makers, to articulate the value proposition so that CEOs, partners, chief control officers, chief compliance officers, heads of businesses all understand that what we could do could create a more successful business than we have now and a safer business at the same time. And once you get them on board, then the shackles, if you like, the mental shackles will be off, and they will be willing to look at some of the more esoteric approaches. As Satna said, looking outside, as Rich said, looking outside, partnering with expertise instead of fearing it because your IT department is worried about being made obsolete, right? For example, you actually embrace it, and you get your IT guys. You say, look, this is an opportunity for the IT guys to learn and to change and to create more value. But you need to motivate them to do that. You need to get your motivation right. And that's the one thing which I will say, which I wasn't surprised at, but I think is an area that we all have to work on. I keep hearing the refrain carrot and stick. If you look at motivation theory, carrot and stick was for the Industrial Revolution, not for creative, complex industries like ours, because it's an extrinsic motivator. What it does is it forces people one way or the other, or pulls them, or bribes them, or however you want to call it. But intrinsic motivation is much more powerful. That comes from within. And that comes from having a clear purpose, having a sense of mastery, i.e. the ability to grow and to become better at what you do, and fundamentally to have an element of autonomy, which means they're thinking for themselves and able to bring their whole person to work, which, by the way, is another word for integrity. So they can actually bring all their innovation, all their creativity, and all their thought processes and their passion into the organization, which will create that return on investment that I touched on earlier. So that's probably where the COO's challenge is, to take advantage of the pandemic and grow the sort of the green shoots that we've seen through the pandemic of productivity and self-reliance and reflexivity.
What we need to do, Patrick, everything that we've got to work out that you've just said, we've got to ask the question how, haven't we? So yeah, I think that's but what I take away from that, actually, that you've got extensive experience in running, moderating, participating in summits or conferences. By the way, the only reason I use summits, I don't like the word conference. So I'm bolstered by your feedback. Miriam, an interesting question for you in relation to that you've listened into the majority of them. You've come back into the industry, and you've got the ambiguous role of being chief of staff. But one of the principal pillars of that is managing the international CRO community on behalf of Armstrong Wolf. What have you taken from these 3 days?
I think because there's the rate of change, as everyone has said, has been unprecedented. That hopefully that leads to opportunities for iCook and for all of us as a whole. What I took away is, I think it's time to work with. So whether that's to work with the regulators, recognize them, let them, accommodate them so they can do whatever they have to do in terms of market protection, but also don't battle them, work with them so that you can create the right environment. I think it's time to collaborate and partner up, not work alone. There's expertise out there, so find the expertise for someone who's done it before, and instead of being siloed and doing it on your own, which I think is the perfect position for Armstrong Wolf. We're here, we've got this host of brilliance, expertise, experience that is very evident over the last 3 days, and I very much enjoy being part of it.
I think it's that we did a lot of work actually in the last 6 months on. We thought we'd better practice what we preach, so we put a lot of work into mission, purpose, corporate social responsibilities. And when we look at our purpose, was to create a platform for information exchange, the sharing of ideas, and the development of solutions to meet market-wide non-proprietary challenges. And I think climate falls into that. In fact, climate should be the number one. And I think I actually think that we come from a generation where we've been blessed by the voice of Attenborough. Yeah, that I don't think anyone, if they close their eyes and think, what's the voice of nature and what's the voice of the environment, then all of us, a bit like Her Majesty the Queen, has been there since 99% of the population in the UK have lived a life where the Queen, there's only one stamp, there's only one head on that stamp. And it's a bit exactly the same in relation to nature, in relation to the only voice in our lifetime is Attenborough. And actually, even to Obama interviewing Attenborough as the worldwide voice of nature. So I think if actually we probably need to revisit, well, not revisit our statement, but revisit what is our how. How can we take our platform at the center of the COO community, which is at the center of the industry, to raise the platform of the imperative nature of certain challenges. And actually talk about the commercial case for climate, marrying it with capitalism. Exactly the same with conduct. It's already conduct's been, give me the commercial case for good conduct. Give me the commercial case for investing in controls and conduct. So it's exactly the same challenge, but I think the COO is far more adept at that. So we've got 5 minutes left, which actually gives a minute each. I'm going to closing comments following this conversation, which in itself has been very enriching. Rich, your closing comments.
I think the fiduciary responsibility of corporations needs to fundamentally change in a capitalist society, right? Fiduciary responsibility is driven by US corporate governance law, which puts shareholder value first and foremost without any competition. That's different in the UK. And if you look at what Jamie Dimon was trying to do last, changing the discussion, it is about changing that fundamental motivation of what corporations are for. But we're still stuck in the 1970s. We're still stuck with Milton Friedman's mindset, which is the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. We need a new doctrine.
Thank you, Rich. Ruth.
Yeah, so I follow that and say that I think that, there's a new doctrine that's actually been around for 20 years, and it's conscious capitalism, which is really stakeholder capitalism. And I think when you think about stakeholder capitalism, it does start to solve some of the problems that we're facing. And I hope it is the future. And I hope that purpose and values are strongly embedded in that, in the way that we go.
Thank you. Mary, can you note Ruth and Rich have agreed to do a panel session symposium on conscious capitalism? Thank you very much, Ruth.
Noted.
Gwen, your closing comments.
Obviously on top of, please come back and watch all of the sessions at some point. For me, it's not about what we do, but why we do it, meaning that we now have a tremendous opportunity to rethink and bring some meaning in everything we do.
Thank you, Gwen. Miriam.
Yes, I think it's on that. We need to go back and have a look at what's intrinsic, and instead of trying to make initiatives, it's part of who we are.
Sapna.
I think that Ruth's point about stakeholder capitalism is absolutely correct, and just managing those stakeholders. CEOs will do a lot of that externally, and I wonder if the COO's role is going to be thinking about managing a lot of the internal types of stakeholders and going back to the why and how we're doing things. And I think this over the last few days we've discussed a lot of the areas that will be on the minds of everyone now.
Before coming to Patrick, it's even in the last 48 hours we've seen the power of social consciousness and power of the community in relation to the response about the European Super League, for example. There was a fundamental misrepresentation and understanding of the value of something to society, putting it to one side because of the name of profit. And you look at the overwhelming, I can't recall many things where you had in fact, you got rid of the tribalism within football, for example, which is one thing they totally underestimated. You had governments, all governments, you had all football teams, all leagues. You had people not interested in football or soccer, as our American friends call it, understanding the imperative nature, the deep-rooted understanding that the tentacles of football are rooted in society. They're not rooted in profit. I think it was an extraordinary 48 hours. And actually, you've got to take your hat off to the humility, which is a characteristic of leadership. The humility demonstrated by the chief executive officers of the football teams that actually then stood down. 3 of them still haven't. but they stood down because they heard, they listened. Now, you could argue whether they shouldn't have done it in the first place, but at least they listened. And I think it was a very interesting case study, in relation to the purpose of football that serves society, as opposed to the overriding the desire for profit to the few. I think it was a very, very interesting exercise in the evolution of capitalism. Patrick, over to you, sir, your closing comments.
I'm going to keep it short. The COO has an incredible position and opportunity to drive the strategy of the organization through purpose and to turn it into a long-term approach, not a short-term. Through that, you actually start to deal with stakeholders. You focus on stakeholders because you're thinking of the long-term environment and so on. So, I would say the COO should maybe have its levers on the internal, but it should be pushing the organization to bring its purpose much more into the long term, because that's to everybody's benefit: shareholders, customers, staff, communities, society, all as one.
Thank you, Patrick. So our time is up. The 3 days are done. My closing comments, what have I taken away from this? I think we are, and I think it's, for me, I've recognized without realizing over the last 6, 7, 8, 9 years, it's been a privilege to actually work with the COO community, where the characteristics of humility and purpose are actually embedded, I think, in the high percentage of people that we deal with. They are fundamentally decent human beings who want to do the right thing. In fact, the amount of times that members of my team and Miriam and Gwen have said, actually, they're just really nice people. And actually, that's a pretty good characteristics to build hope on, I think. I think for me, it also has been the art of the possible. We've never done this before, and through the fortitude, hard work, and collective determination of my team, of course we made some mistakes, but you have to learn from those mistakes. That collective responsibility, they're my mistakes. And I would say that it gives me a bright torch of hope in relation to what potentially this community can do. So I'd like to thank everyone who's attended. I'd like to thank the panelists, the companies that have turned up, the AFME and FCA, all those that have given informed voice, both personal and professional, and those that have actually listened in. If I can ask for those people who've listened in, if you could make a conscious decision to tell 3 other people about what lessons you've learned from it, then we've multiplied our impact by 3. So thank you very much for everything you've done. It's been a privilege. We won't do it again quite soon, Gwen. We'll give it a few months before we do it, but I think we will do it. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
It's
all.
been an honor.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Ruth.
Bye.